Why would states ever limit their own power in war? What conditions make restraint compatible with survival? For most of history, organized violence has followed the logic of necessity. Political communities fought to secure territory, defend borders, expand influence, or preserve authority. In that context, restraint has rarely been the primary concern. Survival precedes morality. Victory precedes compassion. War, at its most fundamental level, has been understood as a contest governed by strategy rather than conscience. And yet, at certain moments in history, something unusual occurs. Power, which normally seeks advantage, begins to accept limitation. Governments agree to regulate their own conduct. They establish boundaries not imposed by defeat, but adopted through negotiation. They acknowledge that even in conflict, some actions must be constrained. This development is not intuitive. States are not charitable institutions. They exist to protect interests, preserve sovereignty, and maintain stability. When they accept limits, those limits must align in some way with the preservation of order itself. The question, then, is not whether moral ideals exist, but under what conditions they become institutional. When does moral discomfort translate into diplomatic agreement? When does outrage become codified into law? And when does restraint cease to be a private conviction and become a shared obligation among rival powers? Modern history introduces a particularly striking version of this problem. As political systems grew more centralized and warfare became more organized, the scale of violence increased. But scale alone does not explain self-limitation. Destruction by itself does not generate rules. Something more must occur. Ethical concern must converge with strategic calculation. This convergence is fragile. It depends on the recognition that unregulated force threatens not only the enemy, but the stability of the international system itself. To understand why states would ever accept such limits, we must examine a moment when violence reached a scale that forced reconsideration. Not because compassion suddenly replaced power, but because power began to recognize that without restraint, it risked undermining the order it sought to defend. If restraint was historically secondary to survival, the 19th century began to alter the environment in which survival itself was defined. Europe entered a period of rapid transformation. States grew more centralized, bureaucracies expanded, railways connected distant regions, telegraph lines shortened communication time from days to minutes. Industrial production increased the availability of weapons, ammunition, and logistical resources. Warfare, once limited by geography and seasonal constraints, became increasingly coordinated and mechanized. These developments did not immediately produce humanitarian reform. They produced efficiency. Armies could mobilize faster. Troops could be transported in unprecedented numbers. Artillery became more precise and destructive. Rifled barrels extended range. Industrial metallurgy improved lethality. Modernity therefore produced a paradoxical development. The same societies that expanded administrative coordination, scientific knowledge, and industrial capacity also expanded the scale at which destruction could be organized. At the same time, nationalism reshaped the character of war. Conflicts were no longer solely contests between ruling houses. They became struggles involving broader populations. Conscription systems expanded military participation beyond professional elites. The battlefield ceased to belong primarily to a contained warrior class. It became an arena for mass mobilization. This transformation altered not only the mechanics of violence, but its political meaning. War increasingly reflected collective identity. Entire populations became emotionally invested in military outcomes. Governments relied on public morale to sustain prolonged campaigns. Victory and defeat were no longer private matters of dynastic prestige. They became symbols of national vitality. Such developments intensified both commitment and consequence. When larger segments of society are mobilized, the human cost becomes socially distributed. Casualties are no longer distant statistics. They are fathers, sons, neighbors. As literacy rates rose and print culture expanded, reports from the front circulated more widely. The experience of war began to enter civilian consciousness with greater immediacy. Yet awareness alone does not generate reform. Throughout history, suffering has often been acknowledged without institutional consequence. The difference in the 19th century was structural. Industrial warfare strained existing military and administrative systems beyond their humanitarian capacities. Wounded soldiers overwhelmed local capacities. Medical care remained inconsistent and often insufficient. Armies were efficient at mobilization, but less prepared for sustained humanitarian management. This imbalance revealed a contradiction within modern statehood. Governments had mastered the organization of force, but they had not equally developed mechanisms for mitigating its human aftermath. The state could mobilize tens of thousands for battle, yet the infrastructure for treating the wounded lagged behind. The limits of organizational capacity became visible. In this context, unregulated suffering began to intersect with political stability. Large-scale casualties affected morale. Poorly managed aftermaths influenced public perception. International reputation increasingly mattered in diplomatic relations. It created pressure on logistics, pressure on public opinion, pressure on diplomatic standing. And within that pressure, the possibility emerged that regulating certain aspects of warfare might serve not only ethical concerns, but systemic stability. The stage was thus set for a moment in which the scale of modern conflict would expose the limits of existing practice. The gap between organized force and organized care could no longer be ignored. On June 24, 1859, the armies of France and the Kingdom of Sardinia confronted the Austrian Empire in northern Italy. The engagement would later be known as the Battle of Solferino. It was part of a broader conflict over influence in the Italian peninsula, but on that day the political objectives receded behind the scale of immediate violence. More than 250,000 soldiers were involved in the fighting. The battle extended across multiple villages and rolling countryside, unfolding in intense summer heat. Command structures struggled to coordinate movements across the terrain. Communication, though improved by modern standards of the era, remained imperfect under battlefield conditions. Units advanced, retreated, regrouped, and clashed again in fragmented engagements that lasted for hours. By evening, the scale of casualties had surpassed the capacity of available medical services. Tens of thousands were killed or wounded. Estimates vary, but roughly 40,000 men were left dead, injured, or missing within a single day. The armies had been prepared for combat. They had not been prepared for the aftermath. Military medical systems were unevenly organized and often dependent on local resources. Field hospitals were insufficient for the volume of wounded. Transportation for the injured was limited. Many soldiers remained on the battlefield for extended periods without treatment. Others were carried to nearby towns that lacked adequate facilities or supplies. Solferino revealed the imbalance between modern mobilization and humanitarian capacity. Among those who arrived in the region shortly after the battle was a Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant. He had not come as a military observer. His initial purpose was unrelated to the conflict. But upon encountering the aftermath, He found himself in a landscape defined less by strategy than by suffering. The aftermath of Solferino unfolded in proximity to civilian populations. Churches and public buildings were converted into improvised care centers. Civilians, lacking formal training, assisted in tending to the injured regardless of nationality. Dunant participated in these efforts. He encouraged local volunteers to treat wounded soldiers without distinction between friend and enemy. The phrase, tutti fratelli, all brothers, would later be associated with the spirit of this assistance. But the structural significance of Dunant's experience lies not in the phrase itself. It lies in the recognition that the existing organization of war had failed to incorporate organized neutrality in care. After returning to Geneva, Dunant documented what he had observed. In 1862, he published a detailed account describing the conditions following the battle and proposing two practical ideas. First, the creation of voluntary relief societies trained in peacetime to assist wounded soldiers during war. Second, the establishment of an international agreement recognizing the neutrality of medical personnel and facilities. These proposals did not emerge from abstract moral theory. They emerged from the inadequacies exposed at Solferino. Dunant did not argue that war should be abolished. He argued that its human consequences should be managed more effectively and more consistently. His publication circulated among political and diplomatic circles in Europe. It resonated within a context shaped by expanding public awareness, growing concern for international reputation, and the increasing complexity of military logistics. Within a year, a committee was formed in Geneva to explore the creation of permanent relief organizations. Discussions soon moved beyond voluntary action toward international codification. The question became whether governments would formally recognize and protect such efforts. The Battle of Solferino did not end war. It did not fundamentally alter the strategic logic of states. What it did was crystallize a contradiction within modernity. Industrial conflict had outpaced humanitarian organization. Solferino therefore stands not only as a military engagement within the politics of Italian unification, but as a revealing episode in the evolution of state behavior. It demonstrated that modern power, in mastering violence, had also created conditions under which the absence of restraint became increasingly unsustainable. The response to Solferino did not unfold as a spontaneous moral awakening. It developed through deliberation, organization, and negotiation. What began as observation became proposal, and proposal required structure. In 1863, a committee was formally established in Geneva to give institutional shape to the ideas advanced by Henry Dunant. This body would become the International Committee of the Red Cross. Its purpose was not to abolish war, nor to challenge the sovereignty of states. Its objective was more limited and more precise: to create permanent voluntary relief societies, organized in peacetime, capable of assisting wounded soldiers during armed conflict. The novelty of this development did not lie in compassion itself. Acts of mercy had accompanied warfare for centuries. It lay in permanence and coordination. Relief would no longer depend solely on improvised civilian efforts or the uneven capacities of military medical services. It would be organized in advance, standardized, and identifiable. Yet voluntary organization alone could not guarantee protection. For such societies to operate effectively during conflict, governments had to recognize them. Medical personnel would need a status that shielded them from attack. Facilities dedicated to the care of the wounded would require formal acknowledgement as neutral spaces. This necessity shifted the discussion from civic initiative to diplomatic negotiation. Representatives of multiple European states convened in Geneva to consider whether neutrality in medical care could be mutually recognized without undermining military objectives. The proposal was not framed as an appeal to universal benevolence. It was presented as a practical adjustment within the conduct of war. In 1864, these deliberations culminated in the signing of what became known as the First Geneva Convention. The agreement established that wounded soldiers, regardless of nationality, were to be collected and cared for. Medical personnel were to be regarded as neutral while performing their duties. Field hospitals and related facilities were to be protected. A distinctive emblem, a red cross on a white background, was adopted to mark those engaged in humanitarian service, signaling their protected status on the battlefield. The significance of this agreement lies not in ceremonial language, but in structural change. Rival states agreed, even while preparing for or engaging in conflict, to recognize a shared boundary. They accepted that certain categories of individuals and certain spaces would stand outside direct hostilities. The commitment was reciprocal. Each government understood that its own wounded soldiers might depend upon the same protections granted to its adversary. The Geneva Convention also reflected a broader transformation in 19th-century diplomacy. European states increasingly operated not only as rivals, but as participants within an emerging international order governed through conferences, treaties, and negotiated standards. Humanitarian law became part of this expanding architecture of interstate coordination. In this early form, it did not eliminate violence or prevent war from remaining an instrument of policy. What it introduced was a codified limit within that instrument. For the first time, restraint in warfare became the subject of formal agreement rather than custom or unilateral choice. The conduct of war would continue to be shaped by strategy and necessity, but it would now operate within formally recognized boundaries. In this transition, ethical concern and strategic calculation converged. The creation of the Red Cross and the signing of the First Geneva Convention did not resolve the contradiction exposed at Solferino. Industrial conflict would continue to intensify in the decades that followed, but these developments marked the beginning of a new framework. Organized violence was no longer governed solely by force and informal custom. It now incorporated codified restraint as part of its structure. This was not the triumph of morality over power. It was the moment when morality entered into the architecture of power. The institutionalization of humanitarian law invites a deeper question. If states exist to protect their interests and preserve their sovereignty, why would they voluntarily constrain their own conduct in war? One explanation is moral. The experience of industrial warfare exposed levels of suffering that were increasingly difficult to ignore. Expanding literacy, a more active press, and a growing sense of international public opinion created an environment in which indifference carried reputational cost. Yet moral discomfort alone does not produce binding agreements between rival powers. For humanitarian law to emerge as codified practice, ethical concern had to intersect with strategic calculation. That intersection was visible in the principle of neutrality. Protecting the wounded of the enemy increased the likelihood that one's own wounded would be treated. Recognizing medical personnel as neutral reduced the chaos of aftermath and limited the spiral of retaliation. In this sense, restraint did not weaken states. It provided predictability within conflict, a structural necessity for modern governments that depend on stable expectations. Even in war, modern states require some degree of order. By agreeing to certain limits, they preserved a minimal framework within which conflict could remain bounded. At the same time, regulation carries ambiguity. By defining what is prohibited, it implicitly defines what remains permissible. Once certain practices are declared unlawful, others acquire tacit legitimacy. War does not disappear. It becomes structured within categories of compliance and violation. States can present themselves as adhering to humanitarian norms, even while continuing large-scale conflict, provided they operate within the recognized framework. This dynamic complicates the moral narrative. The codification of restraint does not abolish organized violence. It integrates it into a regulated system. In doing so, it may reduce suffering at the margins while leaving the central instrument intact. Compliance itself becomes part of diplomatic language. Thus, humanitarian law can function simultaneously as moral limitation and as procedural normalization. It restricts certain behaviors, yet it also makes conflict administratively manageable within modern political order. Is humanitarian law a moral achievement or a strategic compromise? If it is a moral achievement, then it represents genuine progress, a moment when ethical principles reshaped political behavior. If it is a strategic compromise, then it reflects something more pragmatic. States did not renounce violence, they refined it. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. Moral conviction and strategic interest can converge. Yet their convergence is conditional. Humanitarian law persists only so long as powerful actors find value in maintaining it. Humanitarian norms possess no independent army. Their authority depends on recognition and their enforcement on the willingness of states to comply, even under pressure. When strategic calculation shifts, the durability of restraint is tested. The birth of humanitarian law, therefore, should not be understood as the end of brutality. It marks the integration of morality into the logic of power. Whether that integration represents progress or adaptation remains an open question. The tension between morality and power does not disappear. It becomes institutionalized. The birth of humanitarian law did not transform the nature of power. It did not end war, nor did it eliminate the capacity of states to inflict devastation on one another. What it introduced was something quieter and more fragile: the idea that even organized violence could be subject to negotiated limits. That idea rests on recognition. It depends on the willingness of rival governments to accept that certain actions, even in conflict, fall outside legitimate conduct. History shows that such alignments are never permanent. They are constructed, they are maintained, and they can erode. Humanitarian law emerged from a moment when industrial violence exposed an administrative and moral imbalance. States responded by integrating restraint into their own architecture. Yet regulation does not abolish tension, it manages it. The principles articulated in the aftermath of Solferino remain dependent on continued acceptance by those with power. When that acceptance weakens, the limits themselves become vulnerable. The significance of Solferino lies not only in the suffering it revealed, nor solely in the institutions it inspired. It lies in the recognition that the conduct of war could not remain entirely detached from the norms governing political order. Whether humanitarian law represents moral progress or strategic adaptation may never be fully resolved. It is both aspiration and calculation, conviction and compromise. What matters is that the tension between morality and power was not eliminated. It was institutionalized. Civilization, in this sense, is not the absence of violence. It is the ongoing effort to define its boundaries.